Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them.
Hello?
My special guest this evening is a veteran journalist and best-selling author and crime reporter for the Toronto Star. We're speaking with him in Toronto. I want to welcome Nick Prawn to the program, and thank you for doing this interview. Nick Prawn. Well, we seem to have some technical problem here. I'm sure that Nick will get back on air here. I had heard him talking in the background. We're going to be talking with Nick Prawn, who's the author of Lethal Marriage, the uncensored truth behind the crimes of Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. It's a particularly interesting case if you haven't heard about it. Even if you have heard about it, this is one of the few journalists that was privy to all the information that was displayed in court, that was detailed in court, all the graphic details. One of the features of this was that Canadian law, sensing that these people would not have a fair trial and that there would be certainly some sort of media circus, chose to have a publication ban, or what they called a publication deferral of information that could certainly be published later, but not at that particular time. So American journalists were not afforded the privilege of being in the courtroom to witness what some people have called the trial of the century, but certainly one of the most shocking, interesting, fascinating, and incredible true crime stories ever told. And we're going to be speaking with Nick Prawn. I was just speaking to him just before here, so let's see what we have here. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Dan.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, I just introduced your book, and maybe you can tell us, how long have you been with the Toronto Star? And
about 32 years.
Oh, 32 years.
Yeah, and murder trial. Well, I actually followed the first murder and followed the case for about 3 years before it went to trial.
What year are we talking? What year did the trial start itself?
Well, Bernardo himself was convicted in September of 1995, and Karla, it was 2 years before that, I guess, in 1993, when she had her secret trial. And I was just listening to you because it was interesting. The Americans were shut out because it was felt that they weren't governed by the same law, so they would break the pub ban. And all the information would get out about what she had done, and it was felt it would harm the fair trial rights of him, and he might get off, or he wouldn't have a fair trial. And one of the American reporters, I remember him standing outside the door, and he was just sort of looking through the glass doors of the courtroom, and he couldn't get in. And shortly after that, a reporter from the Washington Post, she had an office in the same building, and she came and she started asking me for all the details, and I told her I couldn't give it to him. I couldn't give her anything because I was under a pub ban. And one of the cops had called me up. He said, if anybody leaks this stuff, you're the first one we're going to nail, Prawn, because we figure you're the one that's going to do it. And I just, I couldn't talk to her. And I told her that. And I felt bad because, I'm a reporter, but I had to honor the ban. And she eventually got the information from somebody, I think. And it eventually got out before his trial.
Right. Well, let's go back for our audience here, way back to, for those the people that don't know this story, but still, we still want to lay out basically your incredible book. And really what goes on is that we really need to know, we got to introduce the notorious killer couple who are the starring subjects in your book, Lethal Marriage. Who was Karla Homolka?
She was born into a typical middle-class family in St. Catharines, which is near the border with the States. Her father was and still is probably a small businessman, made and sold lamps. Her mother worked in a hospital. And, in talking to all the neighbors, they were a very well-liked family. They had a swimming pool in the backyard. You'd think it was a very normal upbringing. All the neighbors really liked the family. It was the Homolka place. The Homolka household was the place to go for kids, for swimming and all that. They were a very open household. If you had any deep, dark secrets in the family, you wouldn't think you'd have that kind of openness. And the neighbors really thought there was nothing wrong with her, they really thought she was victimized by him, totally victimized, thought she was an abused wife and all that. And, of course, the truth was quite a bit different. And, there were several incidents of neighbors actually attacking reporters at first, when she had her secret trial, because they couldn't believe that she had done all these things. She liked witchcraft. She was into witchcraft. She was fascinated. Talking to some of her friends, she was fascinated by death. I know a pet had died, and she insisted on dragging her friend along to dig up this pet. I think it was a dog that had died, or it was a cat. And she worked in a very reputable veterinarian place, and at times they have to put down animals or they have to put them to sleep, and that's where she sort of realized how you can drug people using halothane. And she wanted to get out of St. Catharines in the worst way. She was the kind of person who wanted something better, something more in her life than living in St. Catharines is a wonderful community, but she wanted, to move on, maybe move out to the States or something. And when Bernardo came along, here's this big shot guy from Toronto, drives I think it was a Datsun 300 SX, like a very sporty car. And, he was National Lifeguard, which is a very well-advanced lifeguard. And
right.
He seemed like a very glitzy kind of guy. He was an accountant, or so she thought. That was just sort of his lies. He wasn't really an accountant. He was never accredited as an accountant. And he was, good-looking, well-built. And she bragged to her friends that, this was the guy for me. And she was only, I think, 17, and he was 23. So there was quite an age gap there. And then if you are sympathetic towards her, you think, well, then she kind of got drawn in, and once she was drawn in, she was hooked. And those things happen. You get drawn into somebody into a situation, and you get you're sunk. But she had plenty of opportunities to leave him when she realized what a monster he was, and she never did. And I think that's what irritated a lot of us. Not irritated, but when we were sat through her secret trial and we had to listen to all the things that she was involved in, we were just infuriated, I guess is the word. And we had to sit on that for about 2 years until his trial came up.
Let's go back a little bit, because at the same time that this is happening, that their relationship is unfolding, and she is talking to a lot of her friends, you describe in great detail, because some of the documents that you're privy to is that she has all these glowing terms for her fairy tale marriage. This is the man of her life. She's planning an elaborate wedding and has nothing, extolling all the virtues of this man. But at the same time, there's something going on in Scarborough. And for our audience, say in the U.S., maybe you can tell us a little bit, when somebody says Scarborough, we're still talking about Toronto. We're talking about an area of Scarborough, an area of Toronto. Maybe you can tell us what was going on at the same time that their fairy tale relationship was just beginning.
Well, he lived in an area of Toronto called Guildwood Village, and it was something like, I'm dating myself here, it was like where Leave It to Beaver would live. It's a middle class to upper class community. Probably one of the safest places to live. There's, all the years I covered crime, I never actually ventured into that area until he came along, because there was nothing ever happened on there of a criminal nature.
Right.
And on the surface of it, it seemed like he had a very, his father was an accountant, his mother was a stay-at-home mom. However, things are not what they seem. The father, later, as we found out, he pled guilty. He was convicted of sexual assault. And I'd love to get into the details, but we can't, because the victim's identity is protected by law, and it still is. And you can imagine what kind of impact that would have upon a child growing up, to see your father, convicted of a crime like that. His mother, she had her own issues. and there was allegations that she was having an affair and that his dad wasn't his real dad, and all of that played upon him.
Isn't that what she told him at a certain age? She came and said to him.
Yeah, and that had a huge impact on him, obviously. And then he developed like a nervous tic, and on the surface he was the Barbie and Ken. He was the Ken. Here was the guy who was a lifeguard. He was good looking, good build. He went to university, although he took him 3 times to get his degree, and he seemed like the perfect kind of guy. Underneath the surface, he was just a monster. I mean, he was he suffered from narcissism. He was a sexual sadist. He literally enjoyed pain. I mean, he inflicted a lot of pain on the women he assaulted, and he didn't really care. I mean, it never crossed his path that these. That he was really violently hurting these women. He had urges, and he had to, to be graphic, he'd be driving along and he'd see a woman that he liked on the street and he would get aroused. And, I don't have to go into any more details. He would just be, with himself, and he'd be trying to pleasure himself. He's that kind of guy. But, the police who investigated him when he was eventually suspected of being the rapist, he came across as an accountant, kind of a, easygoing guy, good looking.
The fact that he had no criminal record.
No criminal record. Yep. Yeah. And if he had lived in a lower class housing area and he had a criminal record, the police probably would have been a lot more interested in him. But he just didn't fit the Hollywood mold for a serial killer. He was very outgoing, very good looking. He had a job. He had a girlfriend. He had lots of girlfriends, actually. Lots of girls liked him. Or he went around with a lot of. I think one time he bragged that he could have as many as 300 women or something. And he just didn't present the kind of character that you would think. And underneath the surface, he had his urges, and he just, when he had him, he was going to satisfy him no matter what, no matter who he hurt or no matter what he did.
Let's go back just a little bit, because I wanted to. You outlined Bernardo's background, and he does start off with voyeurism, and there is an acceleration. Not to start talking about that theory that some of these criminals start at a certain point and then accelerate, and who knows what they can do. But maybe let's talk a little bit about that acceleration. He didn't go. You're already mentioning serial murder, and maybe our audience is not sure.
Yeah.
What's going on here with these Scarborough rapes? Like I said, at the same time that their relationship was just beginning, you detail in your book that these Scarborough rapes are going on. And as far as you say in your book anyway, that Karla was not aware that she was dating this rapist at that time.
Well, he started out, long before he met Karla, he was attacking women, I think as many as 13. And he was literally following buses around in the East End of Toronto, and whenever women got off at a lonely bus stop, there was Bernardo, and he sort of met her when he was, after committing about, I can't remember the exact number, but he met her and he confessed to her that he was doing all these rapes, and then one of the victims sort of got a glimpse of his face. They put out a very good sketch, and a lot of people recognized him, although not a lot of people went to the police. And I think it was a woman at a bank went to the police, and they brought him in for questioning. And he looked incredibly like the suspect, but again, he was very glib, or he wasn't like from your central casting type of villain, and DNA was just sort of coming into just coming online at that time. So when they got his DNA sample, they didn't process it right away. And then once he was questioned by police, he confessed to Karla, and then the two of them moved out of Toronto. So then the rape stopped. And what happens a lot of times in these police investigations, they have a huge task force and they probe it like crazy, and then when the killings stop or the rape stop, the task force kind of just dissolved. And in talking to the investigators, they wanted to stay with the case, but there were no more sexual assaults going on in Scarborough. In fact, they were moving to St. Catharines, and there was, that lapse in there. So he told her when he was sort of well into his into his spree of rapes in Scarborough, and she I mean, that was her first clue to get out of this relationship, but she didn't. She
right.
She was portrayed as this abused wife and all that, but in all the abused cases that I've followed, or talked to women, usually they don't have a lot of education, they don't have a lot of family, a lot of friends. Karla had all of the above. She had family, she had friends, she had a job. She was not an abused wife. She was a co-accused who got beaten up. I mean, and they try to portray her as an abused wife to us, and I think that's what infuriated most of us then. And to this day, it still bothers me that they were trying to portray her as a battered wife, because all the battered women out there who are genuinely victims, she's not in that category at all.
Right.
So yeah, I still, what? After all these years, I still have strong feelings on that. When we first heard it at her secret trial there in St. Catharines, when the American media was shut out, none of us could believe they were trying to tell us that. There's no way. She's just as guilty as he is. She should still be in jail to this day.
Well, did you make that determination, though, before you were aware of the videotapes, or at least before you were aware of the content of the videotapes? It's easy to see, everybody would be affected by the videotapes. You made that very clear in your book. I mean, when you read the contents, let alone actually seeing the video on a 30-inch screen.
It was what we heard. She set up her sister to be raped by Bernardo. She drugged her sister. Like, she wasn't a virgin. He had this thing about only having virgins. When he met her, she wasn't a virgin. That bothered him. So her way of perhaps making up for that was to set up her sister as the virgin, which it sounds bizarre, but that's. And then she, after setting up her sister, she set up a couple of other young girls at the house where they lived in St. Catharines.
Well, let's get back to the sister. But let's get back to the sister, because this is the thing that I think. I don't care how liberal-minded you are. You are reviled by the notion of this crime. So let's go slow on this one, because this is the most horrifying aspect of this. Completely, is because, especially in reaction, that they continued, that they didn't fall apart, that they didn't commit suicide after this.
I mean, where do I start? I mean, the police botching the investigation, her wanting to set up her sister. I mean.
Well, let's go back with the night in question. It's December 23rd.
Okay.
She is offering her sister, her virginal 15-year-old sister, as a Christmas present to her husband, who, like you have said, has a thing for virgins, because Karla wasn't a virgin, and so she's going to participate in this. What goes wrong? They drug the girl.
Well,
how do they do that? Did they use sedatives?
Karla worked in a veterinarian clinic, and she had access to halothane, which is a drug used to sedate, animals or whatever. So it was her idea that she'd use a little bit of halothane on her sister, put her to sleep, and Paul could do whatever he wanted, all his fantasies with the sister, and she would stay there and she would monitor her breathing to make sure everything was okay. Like, I mean, I'm not making this up. This is what we were hearing in the courtroom, why we were just incensed. And then they gave too much halothane, and she choked on her own vomit. And what happened was it left a huge sort of bluish purplish mark on her face, on her cheek beside her mouth. And the police were called, and two cops came in there, and one was a very senior cop, the other was sort of a rookie. And the senior cop kind of said, well, it looks like an accident, blah, blah, blah. The junior cop was suspicious as hell. I mean, if you look at the picture, you would be. And he was convinced there was something more to it, and he got sort of overruled by his senior colleague, and the whole thing was passed off as an accidental death. Funeral, Paul expressed his, told everybody he was suicidal after that. He was so distraught over her death and blah, blah, blah. And her death was passed off as an accident. And then when Karla finally told people the truth, they, exhumed the remains, and they were able to, piece together what really happened. She was drugged and she was violently sexually assaulted, and it was
And videotaped.
And yes, and it was not an accident. I mean, and we were sitting in the courtroom. We sort of, before we went into the courtroom at her secret trial, we sort of had an inclination that there was something going on with Tammy, the sister. Something we would hear something, and when we heard it, we were shocked. And I can remember being just horrified at the time, and to this day, I still am. And then we heard with Kristen French, for instance, all the things that Karla did. She could have maybe got herself won something or other with the public. She was alone with Kristen French. That was the second of the two victims, and she was alone with her in the house there while Bernardo went out for food. And she was alone with her for like 20 minutes, at least one or two times. And Kristen said, "Why don't you just call the police?" And Karla didn't. All she had to do was dial 911. The police would have been there in about 20 seconds, about a dozen cruisers, and she never did. And she was just, she was obviously just afraid for herself, and she knew this young girl was going to be murdered within the next day or two. And if she was a true battered wife, somehow I think that she would have got the courage to call the police, but she never did, because she knew damn well what we all knew. She was a co-accused. She was a co-conspirator, and why would she want to turn herself in? And to me, that was when we heard those two things at her trial there, it was just like, I don't need to hear anything more about this woman. I think she should be in jail for the rest of her life. And the fact that she's not is a terrible injustice.
Now, after her sister was accidentally killed, these people were already engaged to be married. They already had their wedding plans well underway for the spring, I believe. So they didn't want to change their plans at all. In fact, there was a letter that's revealed in your book, its contents, talking about what assholes she said her parents were, because they were still grieving, and then they wanted to cut back some of the money that they were contributing to the wedding. And it was a real lavish wedding, by the way, but they wanted to cut back some of the money because they just had to pay for a funeral. So it's part of the psychopathy when you can read a letter like that showing the absolute lack of remorse from both of them at that time. But not only a lack of remorse, that would be shocking enough. What did the couple go on to do? You talk about other murders, but after this accidental death, where they come very, very close, they should have been caught. Like you say, somebody should have noticed this wasn't an accidental death. And meanwhile, the Scarborough rapist is on the loose. What does this couple do? What does Paul Bernardo want to do? He says he's distraught over the sister dying, but what does this killer couple do?
He says what he'd like to do is he'd done all these rapes sort of at night and just grabbing women as they're out jogging or coming home from the bus. So what he told Karla what he'd like to do is he said, I think his phrase was, wouldn't it be neat to actually bring a woman home? He can hold her captive, and then he can kind of do with her as he wants at his leisure. He doesn't have to worry about, people coming by, and he could sort of bring her into the house, and then he could do what he wants, like a Silence of the Lamb kind of thing. And again, her hearing that, it's obvious that you do that. You're going to have to kill the person. And don't forget, Karla's quite a bright person. She's very well read. She's not like a dummy. When she was testifying and she was talking about battered wife syndrome, she knew all the symptoms or all the signs. She had them all memorized. She'd read every textbook on battered wife syndrome. So her testimony came across as so phony. It just, like, to this day, you can tell it, when it's contrived. And
right.
So he wanted to bring somebody home. So he kidnapped Leslie Mahaffey one night, brought her home. Karla was sleeping, and Paul brings her in and says he's got this girl here. She's blindfolded and whatever. And Karla says, "Oh, okay." And she goes back to bed. And the next day she's ticked at Paul because he gave Leslie, I think, champagne out of her best glasses. And so she was really ticked at him for using her best chinaware. Could have broken them or something. So,
right.
You have a young, was Leslie 14? You have a young girl that's being, kidnapped and raped and murdered. And what is Karla worried about? Her chinaware, because it's her fine glasses. He might break them while he's giving her champagne.
Right.
It's like you sit there and you listen to this stuff and you think this woman should never be out jail. And the Crown was saying at the time, well, we don't think she'll ever reoffend. Well, and we're all saying in the gallery, well, how the hell do you know that? Like, Jesus, I wouldn't want her as a neighbor.
Well, let's go back just for our audience that it's catching this and a woman's involvement as a co-conspirator with this sadistic rapist murderer or killer, and his Karla, his wife, his accomplice. Now, we're getting ahead of the game if we're talking about this woman at trial and this woman being released and this person being depicted as a battered woman syndrome. So let's just get some of the stuff out of the way before we actually get to the trial, which is, half of this amazing story is the incredible trial. Half of the shocking aspects of this whole book and this whole story are the trial. So how did he eventually get caught? You talked about DNA, and we all know about DNA now. Mm-hmm. We have a sort of a perception that DNA could be tested very, very quickly, but at the time, DNA could be tested, but it wasn't tested very quickly. And in fact, you mentioned in your book, by the time Bernardo was connected, because first they have to whittle it down to 39 suspects, it took 2 years before that DNA sample said, let's go pick up Paul Bernardo. And they didn't go pick up Paul Bernardo. What did they do with Paul Bernardo once they knew he was a Scarborough rapist? Well, they put him under surveillance, but I mean, what was they knew that they had their suspect, but they still did not arrest Paul Bernardo immediately. Their case was not...
It was only when he started beating her up towards the end that she actually went to the police that they closed in. Things were breaking down in their world, and he was smuggling cigarettes over the border from the U.S. and he wanted to be a rap singer, and his whole world was just imploding, and he just took out his anger on her and just kept beating her up, and she eventually went. She went to the police, and then the story started coming out, and then the police moved in on him.
Well, the first thing, though, I thought was very interesting was how she negotiated this deal. She didn't immediately go to the police. She made sure that she had checked herself into a psychiatric hospital. She had found a lawyer. She was already under the negotiations. Like you talk about, she was not a stupid woman. Well, she certainly wasn't, because she made all the right moves to protect herself when she knew everything was coming. When she knew things were going to go down anyway, she made her move, and she made it so.
She got one of the best lawyers in the area, George Walker. He very sharp lawyer. He got her the deal of the century. When she first left Bernardo, she went to stay with her relatives.
Right.
Supposedly she was recuperating from all this, and then turns out she was actually going to a bar and where she met a guy, and they had a torrid affair. And then the guy was engaged, and the guy's wife would eventually, or the guy's wife-to-be, his fiance, would eventually find out that he was going out with Karla Homolka. when her picture appeared in the paper, and she was shattered. And I remember she called me one night, and she was very distraught because she felt that because she was, because of Bernardo and having sex with all these women, that somehow that this fiance would end up, getting it, a sexually transmitted disease, and she was terrified. And she called me, and she was just sobbing. And I said, well, a lot of times the women he raped were mostly virgins, so you probably don't have to worry. You should get checked. But then later at the trial, we see him having sex with a prostitute from New Jersey. So then I thought, oh God. So it was. You'd think that somebody who was gone through all this would probably just stay. If she was a genuine victim, she would have just stayed hidden below the radar. But in fact, she wasn't. She was, going out to bars and looking to pick up guys. And one of the bars she went to was a cop bar. And, some of them almost picked her up until they realized who she was when their other buddies tipped them to that.
Right.
So.
But she had sex with that gentleman in the bar that evening, the first night she met him.
Yep.
Yeah. So she was.
Yeah.
So much for being suicidal and depressed and distraught.
Well, exactly. If she was suicidal and depressed, why is she doing that? She's running to this bar, and the way the guy described it the bartender there described it, I mean, she was literally in the center of the dance floor with a very short skirt, no bra, tight skirt, tight sort of dress, and she was just literally ringed by guys who were all drooling, and there was a surveillance team following her around, and just to make sure she didn't do anything really stupid. And there was a lot of cops in that bar, and when they were moving in, some of the other cops who were following her said, that's Karla Homolka, and they all fled. And the one fellow who she coupled up with, again, tall, handsome, good-looking guy, and they had this torrid affair. He didn't know at the time who she was. I mean, he found out later.
Right.
And just a sort of a little sad little sidebar to the whole saga that showed that she really wasn't this poor victim. She was, in fact, just it's hard to believe that somebody who would come from a very seemingly well-adjusted family, and she had plenty of opportunity in her life to, that somewhere along the line something went wrong with her brain, and she ended up, I mean, she got drawn in by his charm and everything, that's for sure. I mean, she believed he was something that he wasn't. And then when she realized that he was a sexual sadist, I mean, you could argue that that's the point that she should have backed out of the whole thing, but for some reason she didn't. And then she just kept getting drawn in farther and farther with him until finally it was just too late. And when she was alone with Kristen French, she should have called the police, but she was so far. She knew she was in so deep that she would be in trouble, so she just didn't.
Now, you talk about the battered woman syndrome as the defense that she presented eventually at court.
Yeah.
Now, just to give, I agree with you that she wasn't a battered woman in any sense, but at the same time, let's explain the whole story, how this went, how they could depict her as a battered woman syndrome. And this is before the trial ever happened, so there is some maneuvering behind the scenes, legal maneuvering behind the scenes, but at least some evidence that they could use that she was battered was the hospital report where she was beat up with a couple black eyes, and so she did look pretty good for the photos. Yeah. At least there was some evidence of the brutality of Paul Bernardo and the beatings.
The problem was the police, when they went into the house to search it, they didn't know about the videotapes. They didn't find the videotapes, and the videotapes were hidden inside a pot light. And as the copper said to me later, why do you think they call them pot lights? That's where you put all the dope. And the officer who reached up into the pot light to look, didn't reach in far enough. And during the trial, he was forever known as the short arm of the law. And had the police found the videotapes, they wouldn't have needed her as a witness. I mean, they have the evidence right there. They didn't really need her, but they didn't have the tapes at the time. His lawyer got him later and didn't turn him over right away, and there was a whole controversy over that. But eventually the police got the videotapes. So that time they had already made the deal with her. But the deal was, they had the deal, but if she'd done anything that they hadn't told her about, the deal would be negated. But then later on she admitted that, she was involved in another sexual assault of another young woman at the house, but she blew that one away as she didn't remember all the details or something like that. And so, the deal that never should have been made was kept, and it just sort of, kept through the whole trial, and the whole thing was passed off as her as the battered wife. And I don't think anybody believed that theory. I mean,
now you talk about the videotapes, though. I think there's some other culprits to blame here. We haven't gone too much into the bungling police, how many times people reported Bernardo. We won't labor that because it's easy in hindsight to criticize the police. But I think that there is some criticism to be had for this deal with the devil, and it hinges on her being depicted as a battered woman under this battered woman syndrome. So the thing is, when we also talk about these videotapes, you say, well, we never would have needed that deal. They would have not had to give her a sweetheart deal, which was 2 manslaughters, 5 years apiece, and then 2 years in the addition for the accidental death of her sister. Any other crimes that were supposed to have happened, she would have to disclose those, and that's what you just referred to, this woman that, I remember it. It's coming back in phases, but my mind prevents me from recalling all the details. It's like, okay, great, another fanciful tale. But the thing is, what you talked about, the videotapes, the police didn't find the videotapes, but who found the videotapes, and why was the evidence of the videotapes suppressed, enabling Karla Homolka to get this deal of the century?
Well, the videotapes were in a spotlight, and the police spent, I don't know, weeks, if not months, going through the house. And, you know, they often said they were going to tear the house apart, find any scrap of evidence. Well, the major evidence they didn't find. So after the search warrant expired, Bernardo tells his lawyer, Ken Murray, about tapes. They go in the house, they find the tapes. Murray keeps them. And then here's where you have a very difficult situation for a lawyer. Do I turn over the most incriminating piece of evidence against my client, or do I keep them? And he sat on them for the longest time, and eventually they got turned over. By that time, the deal had already been struck. Murray was eventually charged, and then he was never really convicted of anything, and that whole thing kind of went away. And
why did he hold on to the tapes, though? What was the logic of holding on to the tapes?
Well, it was the most incriminating piece of evidence against his client. I mean, there's Bernardo with the victims, and it's a dilemma for a lawyer. Do you turn over the evidence that's going to convict your client or going to hang your client? So he eventually sought out some legal advice, and eventually it was disclosed, but he hung on to him for a long time, and criticism was he probably should have turned them over right away. But
certainly, yeah.
Then you can argue, well, the police were in the house for 3 months or something, and they didn't find the tapes. So then he had them. So was he under any obligation to turn this incriminating evidence over to the police?
Well, he had the opportunity to seek legal advice, which would have been confidential legal advice. So he didn't do that immediately. He held on.
No,
and I think there's, at least in your book, it seems to be a little bit of an overlap. Sure, he decided to give them up, but he was also negotiating with John Rosen at exactly the same time. John Rosen coincidentally says, "Oh, I'm going to use these tapes to our advantage." You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
something could be said about that overlap. Did he talk to John Rosen, and John Rosen say, "Hey, listen, I've done 100 murders, and you have done a few. I know how to take." At least he knew what evidence was going to be given to the Crown Attorney.
And then when Rosen got them, and he realized what they were and how horrific they were, he just there was no doubt in his mind he had to turn them over. I mean, it was.
No, but he's doing that out of legality, though. He knew that anybody that holds on to these tapes is going to be in serious trouble. Legally.
You're basically suppressing the key evidence in a major murder case, and it's
physical evidence. It's physical evidence becomes, even though it's documentary evidence, because it speaks to all these things. It becomes physical evidence. It becomes very important evidence.
I mean, the police were there, and it's not as if the police didn't know that there was evidence in the house. I mean, they had the house under surveillance, and I know I sat outside that house for weeks on end, just watching them go in and out and tearing it apart, and the fact that they missed the key piece of evidence was just astounding. I mean, it's always easy to criticize the police after the fact, but in this case, well, had they had the tapes, they wouldn't have needed Karla. But she already had the deal, and then even when she admitted other crimes, they still kept the deal. There was some. It was baffling to us. It would just none of it actually made sense. I mean, it was a kind of a case that you're thinking this is an embarrassment. This is like I was reading a website before I talked to you. It was the worst case of jurisprudence in Canadian history or something. It was just truly awful. Truly, the worst deal in Canadian jurisprudence is one of the.
Now, speaking of Karla Homolka and her deal was to testify against her husband.
Yep.
How did she do? I know that you talk about in your book. It was incredible to me, having been involved in a trial myself. Well, of course, this is a much bigger trial, much more important, that they spent hundreds and hundreds of hours, we'll say, in preparing her for the difficult cross-examination. There's the direct examination for people that don't know, where the prosecution asks you questions, but much more difficult is when the defense sets upon you in cross-examination, asks you questions. So how did she do?
Well, when she was a Crown witness and their chief Crown witness, so you would think, in most cases, the chief Crown witnesses are going to be treated very tenderly, or they're going to be given the benefit of the doubt. They're going to be helped through. And in Karla's case, well, how graphic do I have to be here? There was 2 27-inch screens in the courtroom in front of us.
Right. And
the first day Karla was on the stand, she was, the Crown's witness, and Ray Houlihan was there, and he played a videotape. And the videotape was a naked Karla Homolka pleasuring herself. And it went on for, I don't know, like 10 minutes. She was totally naked, and Karla looked at Ray Houlihan. Karla had this habit of not moving her head, just moving her eyes sideways. Mm-hmm. And if looks could kill, he was a dead guy. I mean, she was just furious. And then Ray said, it was one of the only time in the whole trial that you laughed. He said to her, Miss Homolka, what, if anything, are you doing on this videotape? And I tell you, we sat there and we couldn't help it. Like, what do you think she's doing, Ray? She's, it's obvious. And so it kind of went downhill from there. I mean, here is the Crown literally attacking their chief witness. So when Rosen got a hold of her, it just, she had she knew all the right things to say about, how she was battered and this and that. It sounded like she'd read every single textbook going. And sometimes when you see witnesses on the stand, you can hear the sincerity in their tone. They're just they talk, they make mistakes, they don't know everything exactly. But she was so well coached and rehearsed, it just sounded too phony by half. And it just what can I say? It was a farce. I mean, really, it was just. She should still be in jail, really.
But to give her a little bit of credit, she was on the stand for 16 days.
Yes, it was
9 days in 9 days in I think in direct examination and 7 in cross examination. So was she looking was she looking like Barbie when she went to court though? What was she looking like? What was the reaction from people in the courtroom about her sexiness and her allure?
The artist probably described it best. There was about 6 artists there, and they were very talented people, and none of them could capture her face, and they were all commenting on it. Like, everything about her was elusive. She was interviewed by about a dozen psychiatrists, and they couldn't seem to get a handle on her true character either. Like, sometimes this guy's a complete nut bar, or he's a good guy who just went wrong, but they just couldn't. Nobody could quite get a handle on what kind of person she really was. From the sketch artists who couldn't really seem to draw her, to the psychiatrists who couldn't really quite get a handle on her. She was very, she wasn't like an extreme on either side. She was sort of a blur somewhere in the middle. Like, you could see some of her reasons, but then the things she did were inexcusable. But on the other hand, she, it was kind of like with him on the stand, it was like he got up on the stand and he actually thought in his mind, in his narcissistic mind, he thought that he was going to sweet talk the jury into showing that she had done the murders and it wasn't him at all. And he got up there and he was very expressive with his hands, and he was talking quite, openly, and just seemed very alive. And then as the trial wore on, and as the scowls of the jurors got to him, as later on the stand, you could barely hear him speak. He knew he was done like dinner. But that was Paul Bernardo. He thought he could probably talk his way out of it.
Do you think his lawyer advised him to go on the stand? They normally don't.
Yeah, but I think in this case, because he wanted to blame Karla for the murders, it
was the only way. Yeah.
Well, how else can you do it? It was the only
exactly.
way. It was a total long shot, and nobody believed it for a minute.
Right.
I mean, nobody believed it at all. And so I guess it was a question: what has he got to lose? And so, yeah, it was.
And the thing is, it was a victory for the prosecution because he was given first-degree murder, which makes sure that he doesn't have a parole eligibility for 25 years.
And he's also declared a dangerous offender, which means that he could be jailed indefinitely, and that his case can come up for review every, I don't know, whatever it's 3 or 4 years. But when I went to the prison there, one of the people I talked to said, he'll live, grow old, and die where he is now. And I mean, where he is now is in a, I saw his area, I saw his cell, and if it were me, I'd rather take a needle in the arm than live like that. I mean, he's got his just rewards. This is a guy who loved to travel all over the states, all around, all over the place. He loved to, go out and be the big shot guy, spend a lot of money, the big rap star kind of guy. And now he's in a cell that's about 3 paces long by about your wingspan of your arms wide, and the smell in there would knock you out. It's like 100 dead bodies. It's just a stench, because I think there's like about 24 guys in there, and I don't think any of them have ever showered in years. It was quite a place. I thought, you know what? Quite fitting.
So he's in segregation as well. So he's not in a general population. He's a reviled criminal, and he's in, like you say, with a dozen or 24 guys, and that's it.
It's a special wing, and on the outside doors of the wing, there's iron bars, but there's plexiglass on the outside, or on the iron bars on the outside. And I asked my tour guide why the plex, and he said, well, that's because the other prisoners, when they walk by, these are the most vile creatures because they've raped and killed children, so they always throw stuff at them. And when you walk into his range, there's a plexiglass shield over the. There's 2 or 3 guards there who monitor them 24/7 on closed circuit to make sure they don't harm themselves. And over them is a plexiglass shield. And I said to my tour guide, why the plexiglass shield? And just as I said that, a volley of fecal matter came hurling out of one of the cells beside Bernardo. And that's what they do to amuse themselves. They collect their fecal matter and throw it at the guards. But they hit the guards. It actually hits the shield and kind of just drips down to the floor.
Yeah.
And he was in there, and basically, they do get out. They're allowed yard. They have their own private little yard. There's also a house on there inside the prison where you can have conjugal visits. And supposedly, there's some woman who is still going to visit him. His family can go visit him.
You're kidding me.
I wish I were. I were.
I didn't know that conjugal visits were for everybody. Are you sure that he has the opportunity for conjugal visits? Because
you're allowed to stay in this house. There's actually, I think there's 2 houses in there, like a little small little house right inside the prison. Mm-hmm. And you're allowed free use of the house. So I mean, if your wife or your came, presumably you could have conjugal visits. And I mean, I never got inside the house, but if he does, I think his parents were visiting him. So, but there was some woman supposedly trying to visit him. I don't know. I just never followed it up. After I saw where he was, I thought, it's very fitting that he'll spend the rest of his life in that hole. And
well, let's talk about one thing. I think for our American audience, and I find it just as a person that came late to this, all the changes in our laws. But when you talk about the dangerous offender designation, he's only a dangerous offender designation because of the rapes. He couldn't be considered a dangerous offender because of the murders. Am I not correct on that?
Yeah, to
me, that's ridiculous. That he would have a parole hearing, I think, to our audience in America and in other jurisdictions, seems absurd as well. What do you mean? And the reason for that is you explain in your book as well. We have something where we don't have consecutive sentences. We give concurrent sentences. So really, no matter how many people you kill, if you're Robert Pickton, you still get a parole hearing after 25 years, unbelievably.
Yeah, it is unbelievable. Dangerous offender, I interviewed a fellow one time at Penetanguishene, it's where they keep them, and he had killed 3 people. And he said had he pled guilty to murder, first-degree murder, he would have got life 25, and he probably would have been out. But what he did was he pled not guilty by reason of insanity, and they declared him a dangerous offender, and basically that gives you the system the right to jail somebody indefinitely. Like they have hearings every 3 years or something, and if they feel in interviewing the guy that he's still a risk, then they can block any parole. So even if he's done 25, say, he still is not going to get out. I mean, he has to clear the dangerous offender. The panel at the dangerous offender hearing have to be convinced he's not a danger. And how could you, somebody like Bernardo, how could you say he's not a danger? So he'll never get out. So I guess that's the Canadian way of keeping somebody locked up forever. Rather, I know in the States you get like 600 years. He would have got like 600 years for this and never get out. But here it's, life with parole after. He can actually apply after 15 years too. The faint hope clause, they call it.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, it's for somebody like that, you should never be out. And
now talk about rehabilitation. Now we have Karla now. Let's get back to Karla because the story doesn't end here yet. You figure, he's locked up. Well, what about his partner? She gets 12 years, but really in Canadian law, she would be automatically out without parole in 8 years. And what I thought was really fascinating about your book, you talk about that she said at trial that the deal was that if she had the 12-year sentence, they wouldn't. Now, you can correct me on this one because I want to know a little bit more about this, that they wouldn't oppose, the authorities wouldn't oppose her being released after 4 years. Now, do you remember anything about that? I know it's a long time ago. But that's what you said in your book, that she had said that the authorities, now I don't know if the authorities mean the police, because the parole board obviously is a separate entity.
Yes. But at least... Well, what happens is you have a hearing, and if the police come forward or the prosecutors come forward and they say, well, we have a strong case why she should be kept up, she should not get parole, that would obviously carry a lot of weight and at the hearing. And if it's say if it's only not only, but say if it's the family of the victims come forward, well, they may not have as much weight. They may not carry as much weight at the hearing as the prosecutors or the police would have. So by saying that, what they were saying was that would, when her parole hearing comes up, we're not going to get involved. We're going to step back. We're going to, you've done your time, your 4 years, and we're not going to do anything.
Isn't that remarkable too? Though the deal just keeps getting better and better.
I mean, when we heard that, again, like those of us who were covering this, we were infuriated. Like we were infuriated when we heard what came up in court from the prosecutor's side that we don't think she's a danger to offend again. Like how the hell would you know that? I remember I either blurted it out in courtroom or one of the other reporters did, and they had to shut down the trial or something because we were just furious. Like, how the hell would you know that? I mean, how could you say that about this person who set up her sister to be raped or sexually assaulted and died, and there when two young girls were brutalized and murdered? It's
just not an appropriate thing to say. I think it's incredible when I hear that they're unlikely to reoffend. Now let's get back to this unlikely. Let's get back to unlikely to reoffend. Now, she is supposed to get out in 8 years, but the public hears through the media. Again, the media breaks some stories about her partying in jail, and so she can't. The only reason she can't get out after 8 years is because there's a public outcry that what's she doing in there and what the hell. So it's her own deeds, and thanks to the media, and she has to stay in there for another 4 years, thankfully.
Yeah,
but she gets out. Tell us a little bit about just. The Canadian government tried to keep her in. Tell us, just to give us the epitaph on, or at least the latest on Karla, where she is now, what happened to her, and, thanks to rehabilitation, Canadian style.
Well, when we got word that she was close to getting out, needless to say, there was about 35 or 40 reporters staking out the prison there up in Quebec, and she managed to sneak by us, and we were, she was given special treatment. And usually, if a prisoner, they would just have to leave the institution, walk to the bus stop, as some of them do, or else get picked up by family, and we'd see him in the car. But she managed to sneak out, and she went to work for a fellow there in Quebec, and then she got married, and I was sort of there. Staking out the prison, and she totally got by us, and we were there, which in itself was kind of made us all angry because why is she getting again special sort of treatment? she was afraid for her life. All these death threats were against her, So I guess I think maybe that was their reasoning. We have to sort of ensure her safety, until she's off the prison grounds. So we'll kind of quietly make sure she gets out of here, so nobody knows. And to us, that was annoying, to say the least. It was total BS. And she got married, and I mean,
she has a child too, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I know I'm in contact with some people who have websites on Where Is Karla, and I was talking to some of them, not recently, and last I heard she'd moved to the Caribbean or something like that, and I have to admit, I kind of lost track of her after she got out of jail. To tell you the truth, I mean, the woman should be still in prison, and she never should have got out. And it's kind of like a story that you want to forget, and for the longest time I tried to forget, but it's hard to walk away from it because there are so many things about it that were so unusual. Do
you blame the judicial system for its part in this? Do you think they're culpable in any way? That everything from the police to her lawyer to Murray, the Bernardo's lawyer, discovered the tapes and suppressed them. Was it a fiasco in many aspects, or was it just let's just focus on the two killers?
Well, they wanted to make sure they had Bernardo. They wanted to make sure. I mean, what did they have? Did they have a lot of evidence from the house? I can't recall. Not a hell of a lot. And who did they have? They had Karla, and they didn't have the tapes. So they needed Karla. And once they got into that situation where they needed her, things just kind of, had they, it goes right back to when the sketch artist did the incredible likeness of him based on the eyewitness of one of the Scarborough rape victims, had they kept them, or they took his DNA and had the crime lab processed it, like in 2 weeks instead of was it 2 years?
Right.
Had they processed it, well, we wouldn't even be talking here because he would have been caught. And it just went from bad to worse. They missed the videotapes in the house. They made the deal with her. She broke the deal. It was pretty obvious they broke it. She broke it, but then they didn't break the deal.
They were looking for a GM car. They were looking for a Camaro instead of a Nissan.
Yeah, and that, I thought about that a lot too. And when Kristen French was abducted, Kristen was a very careful young woman. She never would have gone anywhere. In fact, she told a lot of her friends, because there was another woman had gone missing there and another one had died mysteriously. And she told her friends, don't ever talk to strangers. They were all, when I talked to them, they were all very clear that she was very careful. Yet when she was walking home, it was Karla acting as a klutz with a road map and pulling out this road map on the hood, and not Karla, who lived in St. Catharines her entire life, asking Kristen French for directions in St. Catharines. Of course, Kristen French the victim didn't know that Karla lived there her whole life. There she is asking for directions, and that was the only reason they got Kristen French close to the car. And then when they got her in the car, who was holding her down while Bernardo was driving? Well, it was Karla. She was holding her down. And police, well, they had to go on eyewitnesses. The person there thought it was a Camaro, and it was actually, what is it, Datsun 300 SX, and I don't think they look alike.
No.
But you can criticize the police for that, but they didn't have anything else to go on. Perhaps in hindsight, if they weren't 100% on the description of the car, they shouldn't have put out the Camaro. And what happened was all the Camaro users and drivers in St. Catharines were immediately suspected. So what they did is they all banded together, and they had this massive drive downtown saying, we didn't kidnap her, we're innocent, we want to help the police in any way we can. So you had a whole cavalcade of Camaro drivers driving through St. Catharines claiming their innocence, because anytime you saw a Camaro, the person was immediately suspected as being the abductor of Kristen French, and in fact, Bernardo never drove a Camaro. So
well, Paul, Nick, we've got to wrap this up. I know
okay.
We could go on for a long time. I want to thank you very much.
Oh,
and I want to tell
welcome.
our audience that you've been listening to Nick Prawn. He's the author, veteran journalist and author, and of his incredible book, Lethal Marriage, The Uncensored Truth Behind the Crimes of Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. Thank you very much, Nick Prawn, for a great interview, and have yourself a good evening.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, good night.
You've been listening to the program True Murder with your host, Dan Zupansky. Have yourself a good evening. Good night.